Texas and Alabama, the game of the week in college football, is finally here. And it's quite amazing to think that these two programs haven't met since we saw them in the national championship game more than a dozen years ago. Of course, you guys remember that Colt McCoy getting injured early in that game for Texas and Alabama pulling away to win a national championship. And the both programs have been on kind of opposite trajectories since then. Texas, on again, off again, but hasn't been able to win a Big 12 championship, and obviously has not been back to the BCS National Championship or the College Football Playoff. Alabama has since won 7 SEC titles and 5 national titles under Nick Saban. Now they meet once again in Austin, Texas. Texas with an opportunity to show that they're back early in the Steve Sarkisian era, and of course against Nick Saban. To talk more about this last decade and what to expect going into Saturday, we turn to Travis Reier with Bama Online and Chip Brown with Horns 24/7. Guys, so take me back to that night in the BCS National Championship game and where both programs were at that moment and where you guys thought they might be going in the years after that. Let's start with you, Chip.
Well, Mac Brown is convinced that he had the game plan to win that game. Texas got off to a good start in that game. Probably should have been up more than 6-0. They had intercepted a fake punt. And then Colt McCoy gets hit by Marcel Darius. He does not return to the game. And Alabama, took advantage of Garrett Gilbert, the freshman quarterback who had not seen a lot of reps that season, built a 24-6 lead. Texas actually got back into that game, only down 3 points with a little more than 3 minutes left, but a strip sack and then another touchdown allowed Bama to pull away in that one. Afterward, I'll never forget, Dennis Dodd of CBS Sports said to Mac Brown, "Well, Mac, we'll never know." And Mac looked at him with this fierce glare and said, "It wouldn't have been close." And he lost his mind after that. Not, figuratively, but he was so upset that Texas didn't have a running game to fall back on that he kind of scrapped the offense that he had and tried to run a pro-style offense in 2010. They had a 5-7 season, and the program's sort of been lost at sea since.
Yeah, I think for the Alabama perspective, it's interesting because there's always that question of if Colt hadn't gotten hurt from that game in January of 2010. And then most recently, you look at Alabama's situation in the college football playoff with no John Mechie and no Jamison Williams. So it kind of shoe on the other foot for Alabama. So I think a lot of Alabama fans have had to be careful with how they've talked about that Georgia game in January because they remember the situation with Texas a dozen or so years earlier. But yeah, the injury obviously was key in that game. It was also important that Alabama's run game was able to take care of business because you think about Julio Jones at wide receiver for that Alabama team, and it was a very minimalistic passing attack for Greg McElroy in Alabama that night. But you had Mark Ingram, Trent Richardson both go for 100 yards. And what about that finish? Eric Anders, now a UFC fighter, comes up with the big play there late on Gilbert to help seal that game with the sack.
It's crazy to think, it seems so long ago, but it's so fresh in the mind. I was looking just over the stats in the box score to refresh my mind on this, and both teams finishing with under 300 yards of offense, which nowadays that sounds like a game that would involve Iowa and an Iowa clone. Everybody's putting up 500 yards of offense nowadays. These two programs in different spots obviously going in, but still, of course, the two biggest brands out there. And when they meet Saturday, what is at stake, so to speak, in your minds going into this?
Well, for Texas, it's a chance to reshape how the program is viewed. It's been known for losing games that were unthinkable. There's been that clunker loss seemingly in every season since that 2009 season. And even though they went to the Sugar Bowl and beat Georgia in 2018 when Sam Ehlinger said we're back, and then they weren't, it's been a struggle. And from school leadership, I mean, they've had 3 presidents, 4 athletic directors, 4 coaches, numerous coordinators. The program has just been a revolving door of change, and Alabama's been the picture of consistency under Saban. Now, Travis and I were talking about this earlier. I mean, Saban's coordinators get picked off seemingly every year, but Saban has done such a good job of bringing in heir apparents in terms of former coaches who come in as analysts and are ready and able to take over when a coordinator gets hired. So it's been phenomenal, and no one has adapted better to the changing landscape of college football than Nick Saban. And I think Steve Sarkisian, who of course worked for Nick Saban, was a part of that 2020 national championship run, appreciates that about Saban. And I think Sarkisian is more Saban than Pete Carroll, the other coach he brings up as a mentor. Carroll was open and freewheeling. Sarkisian now is all about not letting any coordinators talk and keeping things really buttoned up. And I think, this is a chance for Sarkisian and the Texas program, especially with the recruiting momentum that they have, to really continue to build on that. And these are the kind of games. I mean, Sarkisian does not have a signature win at Texas yet. This definitely would fit that.
Yeah, I think for Saban, you talk about the mentor angle. It's time for the mentor to get back to flexing on the disciples, right?
Yeah.
Lose 2 games last year after that long run of wins against former assistants under Nick Saban, and Jimbo got him last year, and then Kirby gets him in the national championship game. Now he got Kirby pretty good in Atlanta, but we had grown accustomed to that almost being a given. Also, this isn't a time of year that you see Alabama lose games, right? First couple of weeks of the season under Nick Saban, that just has not happened. So I think for folks that are maybe looking for chinks in the armor, if you don't win this game, that's maybe a little bit of an indication. Who knows what it really means, but it's something else that we hadn't seen in a while, or if at all, in Nick Saban teams at Alabama happen this early in the season. Week 1, week 2, September in general, those have typically been, undefeated type situations for Alabama.
Chip, what would your reaction have been after that national championship game in January 2010 if I came to you and said, Texas isn't going to win a Big 12 title between now and 2022?
Yeah, it seems hard to believe because that was a golden decade for Texas in all sports. I mean, they won, 2 College World Series in baseball, went to Final Fours in men's and women's basketball, won the national championship in football in 2005 and played for it again in 2009. I think Texas fans had gotten spoiled, kind of like Alabama fans have been spoiled by Nick Saban. And so to think that it would just completely fall off the ledge and become what it has, which is, I mean, Texas is more closely resembled Auburn and their penchant for changing out coaches than, the long tenures that Texas football had come to appreciate about Darrell Royal and even Mac Brown, 16 years for Mac Brown. So it's stunning. It is stunning. And every time people ask what's happened to Texas football, all of what I just said has happened. The change in leadership, the lack of alignment from president, athletic director to coach, because after DeLost Dodds was the athletic director for 32 years, they bring in Steve Patterson, who was basically brought in to fire Mac Brown, and then he didn't. And it cost a bunch of big money boosters at Texas a chance to try to go after Nick Saban and then, Charlie Strong, Tom Herman, and now Steve Sarkisian. So I think Texas fans feel like with Chris Del Conte as the athletic director, everything's moving in the right direction except football. They've won 2 Directors' Cups in a row, and football is the non-contributor in that, which is, amazing. And that is something that all Texas fans are ready beyond belief to see change.
Okay, so when we look at this game Saturday, I think everybody from the outside looking in just goes, well, Alabama's got every advantage. But this game's in Austin, and rarely do we see big-time programs going on the road into a big-time environment early in the season. A lot of neutral site games. Alabama's been in a lot of neutral site games, so that makes this a little bit different. What advantages does, one, Alabama have going on the road, Travis? And then two, for Chip, for you, what personnel advantages does Texas have that maybe we aren't really focusing on or talking about?
Yeah, from the Alabama perspective, you got to go back to Penn State in 2011, really, to find another time where they were in this type of spot, a true road pit early in the season. So it's been a while. Now, I will say this, where Alabama has some advantages in that scenario is returning starter, not only at quarterback, returning starter at center, and also a second-year offensive coordinator in Bill O'Brien, who has worked with these guys. So they went to Texas A&M last year. They went to Gainesville last year. They went to Auburn last year and blew out Mississippi State on the road. Now, those other 3 games were 4-quarter and beyond games. Yeah. And we know they lost at Texas A&M. Florida, they got out to the 21-3 lead in the first quarter and then had to hang on for dear life. Auburn 4 overtimes. So I think this team, if it truly is a step above what we saw last year, if they get out to that kind of start, it shouldn't be an issue of hanging on this time around. But there is a history there from a year ago where they had to play all they could and then some to get the job done. And even then it wasn't enough in College Station.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that Texas needs Quinn Ewers to have a Zach Calzada game Saturday, because I'm not sure that Calzada is in a 2 deep right now. But they do need Quinn Ewers to play, the best game of his college career. And he's a wild card. He's an unknown. Texas has had some guys kind of come out of nowhere. James Brown, Major Applewhite, who played really well when no one was expecting it in big time games and pulled some upsets. But, this one, you have Steve Sarkisian, who's got familiarity with the Alabama way and with Pete Golding. I think Sarkisian wanted to hire Pete Golding, quite honestly, but, and you've got a few Alabama players who've transferred to Texas, Jaleel Billingsley, Ajayi Hall, Keelan Robinson, who, might, according to Texas players, they have some intel about tendencies and this kind of thing. That stuff's going to last about 5 minutes. Once the ball is snapped and it's the heat of battle, it's going to come down to, can you be the more physical football team? And Alabama is so used to being the more physical football team. That was probably one of my complaints about year one for Steve Sarkisian. I didn't think Texas was as physical as they were under Tom Herman. Tom Herman, say what you want, the Urban Meyer fear factor, those players played hard, really physical. And I thought they needed to be more physical, especially on defense last year. So there's a lot of things that Texas has to prove to itself before they can probably prove it to Alabama or anyone else. That's a lot to ask to come together in a 3.5-hour period on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier in the week, Chip and I. You typically think of the road team having to survive the early storm, right? It might be the other way around this week. This is a Texas program that we know is still in the midst of a culture change. We know it's a fan base that is understandably fragile, I would think, in some situations like this. So imperative for Texas to at least get through the first 15 minutes in good enough shape to keep this thing on track for potentially a 4-quarter football game.
So yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the matchups, there's a sense that maybe Alabama doesn't have the kind of receivers that they've had. Certainly, I mean, when you look at Ruggs and Judy and Devontae and my gosh, Waddle, the list goes on. You know, Texas's defense has, again, a lot to prove. Their secondary was not a strength last year, so maybe Texas can hold up a little bit better against Alabama. But you've got Bijan Robinson, who's one of the best players in college football, but you've got two true freshman offensive linemen trying to block Will Anderson, Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell. I mean, Sark's going to have to call the game of his life for Texas to, you know, be able to match the kind of firepower that Alabama has.
So these are the records that the programs had since they met in the BCS National Championship in January 2010. Alabama, 164-17, 7 SEC titles, 5 national championships. Texas, 96-68. Okay, we always talk about giving game predictions and everything. Where is Alabama in 10 years? Where is Texas in 10 years? And do they have similar success stories, or is one kind of in the position Alabama's in today and one's in the position Texas is in today? What do you guys think?
Wow. Yeah, I'll say in 10 years, Brandon, Alabama is just kicking off year one under Lane Kiffin after Nick Saban retires at an even 80.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's impossible to kind of think about, and it's something I know Alabama fans do not want to think about. But you know, I think the thing for Alabama is it's easy to fall into the trap of that it's always been like this, and it hasn't. I've covered this program through some really, really low points. So you know, they struck gold. There's no doubt about it with the hire of Nick Saban, and to think that they can replicate that when he leaves, that might be a little bit naive, I'd say. So, you know, I don't see Nick being around in 10 years. I know some Alabama fans won't want to hear that. But I honestly can't pinpoint one individual right now and say, oh, yeah, Dabo doesn't make any sense. Dabo didn't make sense a couple of years ago. So, even when you try to connect some of the obvious dots, you come up a little bit empty from the Alabama perspective. I mean, look, Alabama has won 10 games under just about every coach they've had. Mike Shula, Mike Dubose, Mike Price didn't get an opportunity, obviously. Dennis Franchione. I mean, all these guys have had 10-win seasons at Alabama. Where it gets different and where the meat grinder comes in is doing it year in and year out. And that's where Saban is totally on a different level than everybody else.
Yeah, Texas has to find, and maybe it's Steve Sarkisian. You know, Sarkisian's best year as a head coach was a 9-win season at USC. That, you know, 10 wins wasn't enough for Texas fans with Mac Brown because he had built it to where they were getting spoiled. And we've seen it at Nebraska. We've seen it at programs that were perennial, showing up in the BCS national championship picture and then fall off. If Steve Sarkisian can maintain the momentum that he has in terms of recruiting, he's got, you know, Gary Patterson as an analyst and kind of, you know, build the enterprise the way Nick Saban has, then he's got a chance. But good heavens, you know, for Texas fans, they're watching Baylor, which came off the funeral pyre with our Bryles win big with Matt Rule, then win a Big 12 championship with Dave Aranda, and they're going, what on earth is happening here? So they've got to, you know, build and stack and continue to get player evaluations right, especially at the quarterback position, because Texas fans can tell you that since Colt McCoy, it's been just a desert.
And that's everything. The quarterback position. And if you're Alabama and you're thinking this is it with Bryce Young, you know, you got Jalen Milroe, you got Ty Simpson in the pipeline, and maybe one or both of those guys will prove to be elite. But you kind of knew it was coming with Tua. Jalen was very good. Mac was a little bit of a surprise, but he got the end of 2019 to really get himself into that situation after Tua was hurt. Then you go right into Bryce Young. How long can you realistically stay on a quarterback heater, even at Alabama or Texas?
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal what Alabama's done, and Texas has a guy who's trying to emulate the Saban
And maybe
blueprint.
Texas is about to go on that run with Ewers and Arch coming in there.
Yeah,
Okay,
that
guys.
certainly helps because Vince Young transformed the Texas football program. He transformed the leadership of that university, got him to relax and let him, play his brand of football, and it paid off in the biggest way.
All right, I'm not gonna let you guys off the hook. But how do you see this game transpiring Saturday?
Well, I think Texas, is a 20-point underdog for a reason because they lost at home to Kansas last year. So they've got to, get a new mindset in this program, and we'll see. We'll see if Steve Sarkisian and all of his team building, his culture Wednesdays this offseason has paid off like that. But there's just not enough war daddies, if you will, especially on defense yet. I think Alabama probably covers in this one unless Quinn Ewers and Bijan Robinson have a game that people will never forget.
Yeah, I think the game comes down to obvious things like turnover margin. If you're going to beat Alabama, Quinn Ewers, first and foremost, has to take care of the football. I know you got him in there and you feel like he can, help in the way of explosive plays with those weapons that Texas has. But lines of scrimmage are boring, but they still go a long way in determining football games. And that's where Alabama, on paper at least, has a pretty decided advantage in this game. Roster from top to bottom, Alabama, I think, still a little bit advanced in comparison to Texas. We talked about this earlier in the week too, Chip. This is a game that I think in a year from now, when Texas goes to Tuscaloosa and you consider the scenarios at some key positions and just from a general depth perspective, that Texas team is going to be far more equipped, I think, to do the unthinkable this year. So, yeah, I think Alabama probably wins the games. I wouldn't mess with 20 points, though. I mean, that's a lot of points. And as I said earlier, the start to the football game. If Texas can keep this thing manageable going into the second quarter, it has a shot to have a shot in the second half.
Yeah, and Texas played LSU a couple of years ago when LSU won the national championship and played them to the end. I mean, they had to convert 3rd and 17. Joe Burrow to Jefferson for one of the biggest plays you'll ever see. Texas doesn't have that experience at quarterback and a leader like Sam Ehlinger, but they came out of that game with a loss, but I think they came out of it with the fans walked out of the stadium saying, okay, we just played them to the end. And if Texas can keep this game close and it's got relevance in the fourth quarter, look, that's a building block. And no one wants to talk about moral victories, but the way that Alabama's been, taking up residence in the college football playoff, Texas is trying to get there. And if they can keep this one close and battle, their players are going to come out with confidence. They're going to leave the game with confidence. And that's what Steve Sarkisian needs right now.
Yeah, this game for Texas could be like the Ole Miss game was in 2020 against Alabama and Oxford. Remember that game? 63-48, something like that. Even though it was a loss for Lane, you saw that program take steps forward from that point on.
So fascinating. Alabama, Texas, Nick Saban, Steve Sarkisian. So many stars on both sides. We shall see what happens Saturday afternoon in Austin, Texas. For Chip Brown and Travis Reier, I'm Brandon Marcello. And also for our producer, Lance Glenn, this has been the College Football Daily. We'll talk to you again on Friday.